Hello everyone, thank you for tuning back into the channel. It's good to see you again. So today is going to be part of the Pokemon Throughout the Generation series where I go uncover the different Pokemon generations that have happened over the years. And I'm actually really excited for this installment because this is not only, I feel like a lot of Pokemon fans that are around my age who actually started out with this generation, but it also happens to be my favorite generation, or at least one of them. And, it's just something that I've been really excited to talk about because they implemented a lot of new features to the game that um, in the previous games haven't happened before. So I'm actually really excited to go over this particular generation with you. With that being said, the Pokemon games I'm going to be covering today are Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. And I'd like to give a little bit of disclosure in advance because um, I made a video, the last video I made was about the Gen 1 games and the Gen 2 games. But the interesting thing about Gen 3 is this was actually the first time we got a Gen 1 remake. So it's going to play into an important part later, but for now I just wanted to kind of give that brief heads up that I am going to be talking about those games in a little bit of detail too. But going into the introduction, these games were the first games for the Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Advance SP. Previous Pokemon games, they were larger cartridges, so you kind of had to have a, what do you call them, a game console that would actually be able to fit those cartridges in them. But these were actually a lot more smaller, so they were easy to carry around. And one of the things that I really appreciate about these games is that the artists that designed these games actually took a lot of effort into making them design-wise just stand out from the previous two games. Like, yeah, you had tidbits of color here and there, but for the most part it felt pale. But, in the Generation 3 games, you got clear blue, you've got clear green. Like, for Game Boy, for the earlier generation games, they were really ahead in the fact that, the designers took a lot of time to make each different scenario that you were walking into. For example, let's say you were surfing on a lake. They would make sure that the details were very specific. And I'm only saying this for the games at the time because they have improved somewhat over the years, but for the time being, these were designs that I think were very impressive when it comes to the Game Boy Advance games. And one of the things that caught my attention was that, they did something different that I've never seen in a Pokemon game before, and they actually added the feature where you could dive underwater. So you weren't just surfing on it, you could actually literally go under the water and explore certain areas that were, and I think this is like one of the only generations where you could actually do that, because as far as I know, dive has been only a move, not necessarily an HM, versus in Gen 3. Now, the Generation 3 games are interesting because this is one of the first times that the actual story was affected based on what version you chose. And what I mean by that is, while in Gold and Silver, you were able to actually choose which legendary you wanted through the box art. What legendary or what Pokemon game version you chose in Ruby or Sapphire determined what legendary you were going to get and affected the overall story. For example, in Pokemon Ruby, you had Team Magma that are trying to revive Groudon. And in Pokemon Sapphire, you had Team Aqua that were trying to revive Kyogre. And depending on which version you played, it was either going to be Team Magma that was a good guy and Team Aqua that was going to be the bad guy, or the opposite of Team Magma being the bad guy and Team Aqua being the good guy. Now, one of the things, and I said there's a lot to unpack here, because the Generation 3 games happen to be way ahead of their time in the fact that they introduced a lot of new different features. And one of the things that actually stood out among fans was that they introduced. So let's go over the first three. The first thing they introduced were natures, which even at my age, being a veteran Pokemon fan, I don't necessarily understand. But they introduced abilities, which gives them an added effect, as it were, during battle that would either help them, be it an ability that powered up their type move, or gave them, made it so that they couldn't flinch during a Pokemon battle, or what have you. And they added the feature of weather conditions, and that was something that was really pushed upon in this game. I mean, the whole story overall was revolved around the weather trio. But to be, just to give you a little bit of an idea, there's actually a Pokemon that revolves around the weather, which is called Castform. And you get this later in the game, and I'm not going to spoil it for everyone because I want people to go back and play this game, because technically there was a re-release for the Nintendo 3DS, but you just can't beat playing the originals. Because like I said, these games were, I mean, even if I'm speaking for myself, these games were one of the first games that I actually played as in the Pokemon game franchise. I've watched the anime for a long time, but this was the first game that I actually played for throughout. And like I said, there were only 3 games at the time, but the version I started out was with Sapphire. But the point I was trying to make is that the Pokemon Castform has kind of a unique ability, which what I was talking about earlier, and it can transform and change its type depending on the weather condition that it's in. So let's say if you have a sunny, you're using the move Sunny Day, which increases the power of fire type moves, it will turn into a fire type. If you use Rain Dance, which increases the power of water type moves, it will turn into a water type, etc., etc. And they actually added 2 different weather abilities that I think haven't been seen before in the game. They added a sandstorm feature, and then this one doesn't necessarily play into the ability, but it was just something that was seen throughout the game, so it goes back into how much effort the gaming company put into making these games the best that they could be. Is that there was, in one of the towns you get to in this game, you were going to come across a little route right next to it where there's some falling volcanic ash. And like I said, they added a lot to this game. The ash you would think is just a design feature, but actually, if you talk to a certain NPC on that route, you'll get what's called a soot bag. And you can go around collecting soot, and if you take it to this house that's like right outside of the town, that's directly on this route, you'll be able to get a glass flute mate. Now, it depends, the effects differ depending on how much soot you bring, but either way, it's just kind of like a cool mini game that you could do. Another thing that these games introduced, which this is kind of this was the beginning trend throughout all future games. These were the first types where the battle formula was changed up a little bit. Because normally, what would happen is you have a one-on-one battle, but in Gen 3, they actually switched it up to where you were going on, they improvised and created double battles. Now what that means is instead of battling one trainer, and doing a one-on-one Pokemon battle, you would have 2 trainers, and you would have to send out 2 Pokemon in order to fight them. That was something that was not in the previous 2 games. That I think really shook up the gameplay. And like I said, these games as a whole, they were really hyped up. And I remember there were 2 movies released about it, and there were actually 2 spin-off games that were made about it as well. they put in a lot of money advertising to make these games come out and be as successful as they could be. And for how much energy they put into it, they actually made it a lot worthwhile, personally. Um, if you're asking me, they. I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you were around back in my day and you saw how much these games are being advertised, you would think they were the best Pokemon games to ever come out in the history of the franchise. Um, One thing I'd like to point out is that, remember earlier how I mentioned that they had remade the Gen 3 games? Now, there was a reason for that. Because, technically, this was the first time they kind of cut the Pokemon decks in half, and I think they were reaching over 300 Pokemon at the time. So it was hard for them to put all those Pokemon in one game. Well, they remade and had to get it transferred because they were two completely different consoles. They were technically under the brand Game Boy, but they were two separate devices. So what they did is they remade Red and Green and made a newer, updated version called Fire Red and Leaf Green. Now, what that allowed you to do is they would allow you to change from, or trade Pokemon from the previous generation and allow them to go into Sapphire, Ruby, and Emerald. And that was actually really convenient because, as it just so happens, as these games were being released, there was a function or a little device that you could get with the Game Boy games, Fire Red and Leaf Green, that were called wireless adapters. And this was actually really interesting because this is something else that they introduced. In previous generations, they would have you use a link cable. But these wireless devices were actually the beginning of the wireless gaming system as a whole throughout the Pokemon franchise. What they would allow you to do is you plug the adapter into the Game Boy console, and then you could just link up with a friend via that, and you didn't have to get wires tangled or what have you. And you could you didn't have to be right next to each other. You could be sitting in two different separate rooms, or I think you had to be in the general area, but you didn't have to be sitting right next to each other. And you could trade Pokemon from a distance. And that actually made it easier if you had a different copy of the game. And you needed to trade version exclusives from the other game. Actually, that's something I'm going to kind of dive into too, because these generations were actually the first ones that promoted online play. And I don't necessarily understand how it worked back then, but what I do know is that they were really pushing this. Like, they even added second levels to the Pokemon centers where you could trade with friends online, wirelessly. You could battle with your friends. They really pushed that wireless feature as hard as they could. And at the time, that was really impressive, because it was such a frustration to have to try to find a friend, try to figure out the time where you could meet up together, and trade different Pokemon, instead of just being able to do it online. And this was during the early days of the internet too, so there were a lot of bugs in that, but overall it was genius for the time we were living in. Another feature that they added, which I think a lot of players enjoyed, there are two types of Pokemon players. Those are those that play for the game, and then those that play to do the side quests and stuff like that. And you'll see a lot of speed runners try to complete the game as fast as you can, but the games actually added a different category of Pokemon players that gave them the option of entering contests. And they kind of it kind of gave Pokemon moves a different type as it were, because normally you got your basic fire, flying, ground, rock, but in these contests, as it were, you've got 5 different categories. You've got smart, cool, beauty, cute, and I don't remember what the last one is, but they were separated into 5 different groups. And if you took them into the contest halls, you could perform these moves to try to win the contests. And to kind of hammer in that point, they actually added a mini game to go along with that. Now, during the Gen 3 games, they were called Pokeblocks. You know, you pick the berries that you could find along the routes and take them to this little corner in the contest hall and start cooking them and mixing them together to create kind of this little treat that you can give your Pokemon called a Pokeblock. And whatever Pokeblock you gave your Pokemon, it would increase some sort of stat, like their clever stat, their cool stat, or their smart stat, their cool stat, their cute stat, what have you. And it's really interesting how much, I don't know what you would call it, attention they gave to this, because, like I said previously, along with the weather structure that they added into these games, they actually added in another Pokemon that could evolve only if you maxed out its beauty stat. And, you know, I think that was a lot of what was frustrating with the a lot of the players at the time, because this Pokemon was not easy to find. You could only find it on 6 different tiles in a specific route, and even then it was randomized. So, you know, it was really difficult to try to track down that Pokemon. And the Pokemon I'm talking about is Feebas. And if you wanted to evolve Feebas into Milotic, you would have to max out its beauty stat. And I think a lot of players found that frustrating due to the fact that it was such a technical... It was the first technical way to evolve that I could think of. I mean, normally you had your level up by stone, level up by trading, or level up by, what was it? You know, your basic leveling up. This was the first one that introduced a different evolution method, which involving a stat. So, you know, it's just one of those things where, you know, for everything Pokemon Gen 3 did right, there were kind of things that they could have done a little bit better too. Now, I want to talk a little bit about these side games that I talked about earlier, because they are technically part of Gen 3, and they were really interesting, because normally what you would do is you have 2 consoles, and they had to be the same exact one, so like Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Advance SP, what have you. But what they did for these games is they added a way to transfer between your Game Boy Advance and your GameCube. Now, you still need a link cable for that, but the games that they invented to try to make the, the Game Boy Advance and GameCube connected, is that they designed these 2 games where you could trade Pokemon that weren't normally available in said game and move them over to a copy of, like, let's see. The 4 basic games at the time were Ruby, Sapphire, Fire Red, and Leaf Green, with Emerald being not only the first in a set of 3 games, but kind of like the upgraded versions of Ruby and Sapphire. And the interesting thing about that is Pokemon XD, or Pokemon Coliseum, was one of the only ways you could catch the legendary Jirachi at the time, which was a Gen 3 Pokemon. And, you know, you had to have, like, a special item in order to do it. I don't remember exactly what... I think it was a special card or something. I was never actually able to unlock that, but, you know, like I said, it was a great way for them to kind of get their different systems to work together. And, like I said, these games were heavily pushed throughout their time in the spotlight. Like I said, they made 2 different movies about it, and I think for a lot of us millennial fans, these were the first games that we were introduced to the Pokemon franchise with. So yeah, and like I said, the amount of, like, attention they gave to these games, like, remember how I said that diving was an important part of the game? Well, not only was it required to reach the regular legendary, but there were 3 extra legendaries that you can catch if you were able to catch 2 certain Pokemon, a Wailord and a Relicanth respectively, and then you were able to dive underwater and find the chamber where they're, because there were 3 spots in the overworld that you had to get to. One in the desert, one near and I don't remember where the other 2 were. but in order to do that, you had to understand how to read Braille, and you had to use certain TMs in order to get there. And, they just emphasized how important all these new features were. Now, I personally started out with Pokemon Sapphire. It was my first game that I ever played as a Pokemon trainer, and it's just one of those things where I'm a huge water type fan. I love water types. But just looking back, it's hard not to feel nostalgic when you're talking about them, because you just remember how awesome they looked in comparison to the earlier games, and you're like, I can't believe what a huge leap that they took from just standardized colors and what have you to all these new different features. I mean, double battles, weather patterns, contests, Pokeblocks. There was just so much to take in all at once. And it was kind of nice to have all those different extra options to play with. And kind of try to discover. Now, I think I want to round out this video by saying that, if I had to recommend to start out any game for a first-time Pokemon player, try these ones, because they are so cool, and yeah, they're kind of hard to find, but the search is worth it, because, it's like, I guess the best way to describe it is, it's like being able to buy a brand new copy of the game for the first time, and I think one of the things that I liked about it is, this is a complaint I have about the newer generation games, is that in order to trade with your friends on like a Switch game or something, you have to buy a Nintendo account, and it's not like a one and done thing. You have to pay for the monthly subscription, otherwise you can't trade. And that's kind of a pain in the butt, because you're not always going to have the money to keep up that subscription. Whereas, if you wanted to trade with your friends back then, all you had to do was buy a game and buy a link cable or a wireless adapter, and then you could trade whenever you want. And that's going to be something I'm going to get into in the later part of the games, when I get into the later games, but I just wanted to kind of give you a perspective of how Gen 3 looked in our generation, or when our first time playing it. Now, a fun fact I would like to tell you before I go is, there was this rumor going around that in one of the cities, we'll call it Moss Deep City, there was a rumor going around that if you get to the space station and you wait, and you check in with one of the scientists, that they'll say that the rocket is 100% charged or ready to go, and that if you talk to them on that day, you can actually enter the spaceship and go up to the moon and capture a Deoxys. Now, when I first heard that, I actually believed it, and I tried to see I talked to the guy regularly on a daily basis, hoping that one day I'd be able to visit the moon. And I even tried, when I found YouTube, I tried finding video evidence of that. It wasn't until later that I learned that was not true. And it's kind of one of the funny things about playing one of the earlier games. We didn't have stuff like Pokemon Wiki or the internet to fact check this stuff. We just believed whatever we heard until we had proof otherwise. So it's kind of one of those things that makes Pokemon fun for us back then. We couldn't spoil it with the internet or Pokemon Wiki or what have you. We had to learn for ourselves, and I think that was really important for a Pokemon game that's so centered around going on an adventure and finding your own way to play. So yeah, these games, if I'm being completely honest, are perhaps one of my favorite games, and I might be bold saying this, but they were probably one of the best games throughout the franchise. Ironically enough, the one negative review I found was that it was 7 out of 10, and it was because there was too much water. I have no idea where that came from, but I thought it was funny, considering that one of the games is water-based. But yeah, that's all I have for you on today's segment. Next, thank you for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you in the next video, where we will be talking about Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. If you liked the video, please leave a like, subscribe, comment what your favorite part of this generation was, or what your favorite Pokemon is. Just take part in the discussion. I look forward to seeing the comments and having an interactive community. With that, I wish you an excellent rest of your night. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.